Normandy, summer of 1944. Somewhere south of Caen, a German soldier climbs into a shattered Canadian trench. Among the debris, he finds something strange. A submachine gun unlike anything in his own arsenal. Crude, skeletal. A side-mounted magazine juts out like a broken limb. He pulls back the bolt, loads a round from his own ammunition pouch, pulls the trigger. It fires. The cartridge fits. The mechanism is intuitive. Within minutes, a weapon built in a Toronto suburb is working in the hands of the enemy. Most captured Allied weapons become trophies or scrap. This one becomes something far more dangerous, because the Germans did not merely use it, they copied it. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history crashed onto the beaches of Normandy. Among the thousands who waded ashore under fire were almost 15,000 Canadians, landing at a stretch of coastline the planners had designated Juno Beach. They came under the command of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade, and from the first minutes they were fighting for their lives. German coastal defenses, concrete pillboxes, machine gun nests dug into the bluffs, mortar positions zeroed in on the waterline. The weather was poor. The sea was rough. Many of the landing craft arrived behind schedule, and yet, by the end of that day, the Canadians had pushed farther inland than almost any other Allied force on the entire invasion front. But what awaited them beyond the beach was worse than the beach itself. The city of Caen, a vital road hub sitting astride the Orne River and Caen Canal, was supposed to fall on D-Day. It did not. Not on the first day, not in the first week, not in the first month. The German 12th SS Panzer Division, one of the most fanatical armored formations in the Wehrmacht, dug in around Caen with a ferocity that stunned even seasoned commanders. The Canadians were forced into a grinding attritional battle, fighting through hedgerows and ruined villages, through orchards turned into kill zones and fields where tanks burned in neat rows. Operation Charnwood came in early July, an Anglo-Canadian offensive that managed to take the northern half of the city only after a devastating aerial bombardment that leveled much of the ancient medieval center. But the southern suburbs, the high ground, the ridge at Verrières, all of it remained in German hands. The fighting was close and it was constant. Positions changed hands in hours. Entire companies were shattered in a single afternoon. And in the chaos of that kind of warfare, equipment moved in strange directions, weapons were abandoned where soldiers fell, trenches were overrun and then overrun again. A rifle dropped in a ditch at dawn might be picked up by a different army at dusk. Most of those weapons were useless to whoever found them. Different calibers, different operating systems, different magazines. But one weapon kept turning up in places it was not supposed to be. A short, light, ugly submachine gun with a tube receiver and a horizontal magazine. A weapon that looked like it had been assembled in someone's garage. A weapon that, against all expectations, worked perfectly in German hands. That weapon was the Sten. If this history matters to you, like and subscribe so these stories aren't lost. To understand how a crude submachine gun ended up being prized by the very soldiers it was designed to kill, you have to go back to the beginning, not to Normandy, not even to D-Day. You have to go back to 1940, to the smoking aftermath of Dunkirk, when the British Army had just been chased off the continent and had left most of its heavy equipment behind on the beaches of France. Britain was desperate. The island was under threat of invasion. The army needed weapons, millions of them, and it needed them immediately. Before the war, Britain had no indigenous submachine gun of its own. The Army had purchased American Thompson submachine guns, beautiful, expensive, finely machined weapons that cost roughly $200 apiece. They were excellent firearms, They were also wildly impractical for a nation that now needed to arm millions of men in a matter of months. At the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield, two men were tasked with finding a solution. Major Reginald Shepherd and Harold Turpin, working with whatever was at hand, drew up plans for a weapon so simple that the idea bordered on insulting. Their names, combined with the first two letters of Enfield, gave the weapon its designation, the Sten. But the Sten was never supposed to be pretty. It was supposed to exist, and it was supposed to exist in enormous quantities, faster than any weapon had ever been manufactured before. That same imperative crossed the Atlantic. In 1940, Canada established a Crown corporation called Small Arms Limited in the Toronto suburb of Long Branch, Ontario. The plant sat on the shores of Lake Ontario, a sprawling facility of over 200,000 square feet. By early 1942, Long Branch had begun production of the Sten Mark II. Workers received the manufacturing blueprints, and within 7 months, the first guns were rolling off the line. By the end of that year, nearly 18,000 Sten guns had been produced. The following year, that number leaped to over 73,000. In total, the Long Branch plant would manufacture approximately 100,000 Sten submachine guns and over 1 million magazines. 3/4 of the workforce were women. They came from every province. They worked long shifts, and they turned out weapons at a pace that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. The cost per gun was roughly $10. $10 for a fully automatic submachine gun capable of firing 550 rounds per minute. It was an almost absurd equation, and the weapon those women built would go on to shape not only Allied operations across Europe, but the desperate calculations of the enemy as well. The first thing anyone noticed about the Sten was how wrong it looked. In an era of finely finished rifles and polished wooden stocks, the Sten appeared to have been constructed from plumbing supplies. Its receiver was a simple steel tube. Its stock, at least on the Mark II, was a bare metal strut, a skeleton frame that offered nothing in the way of comfort or elegance. The barrel protruded from a short perforated sleeve, and, most strikingly, the magazine fed from the left side of the weapon, jutting out horizontally in a configuration that seemed to defy the basic aesthetics of firearm design. Soldiers who first saw the Sten were not shy about expressing their feelings. The weapon earned nicknames that ranged from the derisive to the profane. Some called it the plumber's nightmare. Others referred to it as the plumber's abortion. The most popular name was simply the stench gun. It was a weapon that inspired loathing at first sight. And yet, beneath its homely exterior, the Sten was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was a blowback-operated submachine gun that fired from an open bolt. That meant the bolt stayed to the rear when the weapon was cocked. Pulling the trigger released the bolt forward under spring pressure. The bolt stripped a round from the magazine, chambered it, and fired it all in a single movement. There was no complex locking mechanism, no precision-fitted parts. The rearward motion of the bolt after firing was arrested only by the mainspring and the bolt's own inertia. The whole system was so mechanically transparent that a soldier with no training could look at the gun, understand its moving parts, and operate it within minutes. It was, in every sense, a weapon designed for the worst possible conditions: mud, rain, chaos. The trembling hands of a soldier who had never fired a weapon before. It did not need to be beautiful, it needed to work. And for all its flaws, the Sten worked. Not perfectly, not reliably, every time. The magazine was its weakest point, prone to jams if loaded to its full 32-round capacity. Experienced soldiers learned quickly to load only 28 or 30 rounds. The single-column feed was a constant source of worry. But when it fired, The Sten put a devastating volume of 9mm rounds downrange at close quarters. And in the kind of fighting that was coming, close quarters was all that mattered. The genius of the Sten was not in what it did, it was in how little it took to make one. The entire weapon consisted of 47 parts. Of those 47, only 2, the barrel and the bolt, required any machining at all. Everything else was stamped, welded, or bent from sheet metal and steel tubing. A single Sten could be produced in roughly 5 man-hours of labor. At peak production in Britain, one factory alone was turning out more than 20,000 units per week. The Mark II cost approximately £2 and 87 pence to manufacture. Compare that to the Thompson, which even at its most streamlined production cost over $200. Or the German MP-40, a beautifully engineered weapon that required far more machining, far more skilled labor, and far more raw material per unit. The Sten was not competing on quality. It was competing on existence. Could you put a functional automatic weapon into a soldier's hands faster than the enemy could kill him? That was the only question that mattered. And the answer, in 1942 and 1943 and 1944, was yes. The simplicity of the design also meant that production did not require specialized arms factories. Much of the Sten's manufacturing could be distributed to small workshops across Britain and Canada. Subcontractors who had never built a weapon in their lives could stamp out receiver tubes and trigger housings and barrel sleeves, then ship the parts for final assembly at a central location. This was industrial warfare at its most elemental. No wasted motion, no unnecessary precision, no aesthetic concession, just output. And the output was staggering. By the end of the war, more than 4 million Sten guns in various marks had been manufactured, making it the second most produced submachine gun of the entire Second World War, behind only the Soviet PSH-41. Those 4 million guns went everywhere, to frontline infantry, to paratroopers dropping into Normandy and Arnhem, to commandos raiding the coast of Norway, and critically to resistance movements across occupied Europe, where the Sten's ability to be disassembled into a few small parts and hidden in a suitcase made it the signature weapon of the underground. The problem with distributing 4 million weapons across an entire continent at war is that you cannot control where all of them end up. In Normandy, the fighting between Canadian and German forces was among the most intense of the entire campaign. The battles around Caen and Verrières Ridge were grinding, costly affairs where the front line moved in increments measured in hundreds of yards. In that kind of combat, weapons are abandoned constantly. A soldier is hit by a mortar round and drops his Sten in a ditch. A section overruns a position, then is driven back by a counterattack, leaving everything behind. A supply drop intended for a resistance cell in France lands in the wrong field and is collected by a German patrol instead. The Allies were airdropping Stens all over occupied Europe, and a significant number of those drops were intercepted. Crates meant for the French resistance were discovered by German forces and shipped to the Paris office of the Reich Main Security, office, the RSHA. From there, the captured weapons were redistributed to rear area and police units that lacked sufficient German-manufactured arms. This was not just Normandy, it was everywhere the Sten went. Every raid, every airdrop, every overrun position was a potential leak in the supply chain. And unlike a captured Sherman tank or a crate of American artillery shells, a captured Sten did not require a complex logistical apparatus to exploit. It was small, it was light, it was mechanically self-evident, and it carried a secret that made it uniquely dangerous in enemy hands. A secret hidden in the cartridge it fired. The Sten gun fired 9 by 19 millimeter Parabellum ammunition. This is a detail that sounds technical and dry. It is, in fact, the single most important reason that this story exists. The 9 by 19 millimeter Parabellum cartridge was not British. It was not American. It was German. Designed in 1901 by Georg Luger for the Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionsfabriken, the 9 millimeter round was created specifically for the German military and its iconic Luger pistol. By the Second World War, it had become the standard pistol and submachine gun cartridge of the Wehrmacht. The MP-38 used it. The MP-40 used it. The Luger P-08 used it. The Walther P-38 used it. Virtually every German sidearm and submachine gun on the battlefield fed from the same 9 millimeter round. When the British designed the Sten, they made a choice that would have enormous unintended consequences. They chambered it in 9 by 19 millimeter Parabellum. The reasoning was sound from an Allied perspective. If Commonwealth troops were fighting in Europe, they would inevitably capture German ammunition. Using the same caliber meant that captured enemy stocks could supplement Allied supply lines. And the Stens magazine was itself a direct copy of the MP-38 magazine, designed so that German magazines could be used in a pinch. It was a clever piece of logistical thinking, but it cut both ways, because if a British or Canadian soldier could pick up German ammunition and load it into his Sten, then a German soldier could do exactly the same thing in reverse. He could pick up a captured Sten and load it with rounds from his own pouches. No special ammunition, no supply request, no waiting for a logistics chain that was already crumbling. Just load and fire. In a war defined by incompatible systems, where American guns fired American rounds and Soviet guns fired Soviet rounds, and each captured weapon usually became a useless curiosity within days, the Sten was an anomaly. It spoke the enemy's language, and the enemy noticed. Understanding the Sten required almost no effort. This was not a weapon that demanded specialized knowledge or weeks of familiarization. The open-bolt blowback system was mechanically identical to what German soldiers already knew from their own MP-40. Pull the bolt back. It locks to the rear. Insert a loaded magazine. Pull the trigger. The bolt flies forward under spring pressure, strips a round, chambers it, fires it, blows back, and repeats. There is no rotating bolt, no gas piston, no locking lugs, no adjustment dials. A soldier who had trained on the MP-40 could pick up a Sten and immediately comprehend every moving part. The only meaningful difference was the magazine orientation. The Sten fed from the left side, the MP-40 fed from below. That was a matter of grip, not of principle. The weight was comparable. The Sten Mark II weighed roughly 7 pounds unloaded. The rate of fire was similar, around 550 rounds per minute. The effective range was short, perhaps 100 meters, which was standard for submachine guns of the era. In other words, a German soldier holding a captured Sten was not holding an alien object. He was holding a slightly uglier, slightly cruder version of a weapon he already understood. And in the chaos of late war combat, where supply lines were fractured and units were scrambling for any functioning weapon they could find, that familiarity was not a luxury. It was survival. The Sten did not ask its user to learn a new system. It did not punish unfamiliarity with malfunction. It simply worked, in the same way with the same ammunition, for anyone who pulled the trigger. That democratic simplicity, designed to arm untrained partisans and hastily mobilized factory workers, turned out to serve the enemy just as effectively. The clearest evidence that captured Stens were more than casual battlefield souvenirs comes from the German cataloging system itself. The Wehrmacht maintained a formal, meticulously organized system for classifying captured foreign weapons. These were recorded as Fremdgerät, foreign devices, or Beutegerät, captured devices. Their technical details were logged in a 14-volume reference set that was periodically updated throughout the war. Each weapon received a standardized designation consisting of a German-type abbreviation, an identification number, and a country code. The code for British weapons was a lowercase letter E, standing for English. By 1944, captured Sten variants had been formally entered into this system. The Mark I and Mark I Star were designated MP748E. The Mark II, which included the Canadian-made Long Branch variants, received the designation MP749E. The Mark III was catalogued as MP750E, and the suppressed Mark IIS, used by Special Operations, executive teams on clandestine missions, was designated MP751E. These were not informal nicknames scrawled in a field journal. These were official ordnance classifications, recorded in the same system that tracked every Mauser rifle and MG-42 machine gun in the German inventory. The existence of these designations tells a story that goes far beyond a few soldiers picking up weapons off the ground. It means the Sten had entered the German logistical system. It means there were channels for distributing captured Stens to units that needed them. It means armorers were expected to maintain them. It means ammunition allocations accounted for their presence. The weapon that Commonwealth soldiers called the stench gun, the gun that looked like a piece of discarded pipe, had been absorbed into the machinery of the Wehrmacht. Not as a curiosity, as a tool. And then came the moment when capturing them was no longer enough. By the autumn of 1944, the German war machine was in serious trouble. The Western Front was collapsing. The Eastern Front was worse. Allied bombing had devastated German industry, and the raw materials needed to produce complex weapons like the MP-40 were growing desperately scarce. The MP-40 was a fine submachine gun, well-engineered and effective, but it required more machining, more material, and more skilled labor than a nation on the verge of collapse could sustain. The Wehrmacht, the Volkssturm militia, the rear area security units, all of them needed submachine guns, and there were not enough to go around. In September 1944, the Mauser works at Oberndorf received a remarkable order. They were to take a captured British Sten Mark II, study it, and produce an exact copy. Not a German interpretation, not a redesign, a copy. The project was given the code name Gerät Potsdam. 2 sets of technical drawings were to be created. One for large factory production, one for small workshops with limited capabilities. This was the duality of the Sten's design now being exploited by the very nation it was built to fight. Mauser, one of the most prestigious arms manufacturers in the world, the company that had built the Carabiner 98K, was now reverse engineering a weapon that cost $10 to make. The Gerät Potsdam was an exact copy of the Sten Mark II, right down to the manufacturing stamps, intended to be indistinguishable from the British original. These copies were reportedly intended for clandestine use, for German stay-behind agents, and the nascent werewolf guerrilla organization that was supposed to operate behind Allied lines. Within 6 weeks, Mauser had produced approximately 10,000 units. But the project did not end there. Even as the Gerät Potsdam copies were being assembled, Mauser engineer Ludwig Vorgrimler was already working on something else. A further simplification. A weapon. That took the Sten's principles and pushed them even further toward crude, rapid manufacture. The result was the Gerät Neumünster, which would become officially known as the MP-3008. The MP-3008 kept the Sten's blowback mechanism and open-bolt firing system, but made one significant change. The magazine well was moved from the side to the bottom, creating a configuration that looked more like the familiar MP-40. The barrel shroud was eliminated. The trigger was permanently attached with staked pins. Everything that could be simplified was simplified again. The MP-3008 was designated the Volksmaschinenpistole, the People's Machine Pistol, and it was intended for the Volkssturm, the desperate last-ditch militia of old men and boys that Germany was throwing into the path of the advancing Allies. Production was contracted out to small companies, many of which had never manufactured weapons before. The variations between individual guns were enormous. Some had wire stocks, some had wooden stocks, some had no stocks at all. The finish was often nothing more than red or black stove enamel. Each one looked slightly different from the last, because each one was built from whatever materials happened to be available in whatever workshop happened to be producing it. The total number manufactured is uncertain. Estimates range from several thousand to perhaps 10,000. An order for 1 million was placed in a fit of insane optimism. It was never fulfilled. The war ended before it could be. But the fact that the order was placed at all tells you everything about what the Sten represented to the dying Reich. It was not just a captured weapon. It was a template, a proof of concept, evidence that you could arm a soldier for almost nothing if you were willing to abandon every pretension of craft. There is a deep irony in this story that goes beyond ammunition compatibility and production costs. The Sten was born from desperation. In 1940, Britain was alone, its army stripped of equipment, facing the possibility of invasion by the most powerful military force in Europe. The Sten was the answer to that desperation. A weapon so cheap and so simple that it could be stamped out by the million and put into the hands of anyone who could pull a trigger. 4 years later, Germany found itself in almost exactly the same position. Its armies were retreating on every front. Its factories were being bombed around the clock. Its trained soldiers were dead or captured, replaced by conscripts and militia. And the weapon that Germany reached for in its own hour of desperation was the same crude, stamped, stripped-down submachine gun that Britain had created in its own darkest moment. The Sten's power was never in its accuracy. It was never in its reliability. It was never in its finish or its feel or the confidence it inspired in the soldier who carried it. The Sten's power was in its refusal to be anything more than necessary. 47 parts, 2 machined components, 5 man-hours, $10. That equation, that ruthless arithmetic of survival, transcended national boundaries and ideological allegiance. It did not matter whether the hands assembling the weapon belonged to a woman in Long Branch, Ontario, or a conscripted worker in a collapsing German workshop. The physics were the same. The bolt traveled the same distance. The spring compressed the same way. The 9mm round left the barrel at the same velocity. In a war that consumed entire nations, that ground through millions of lives and billions of rounds, there was something almost unsettling about a weapon that reduced all of that complexity to a steel tube and a spring. The Sten did not care who built it. It did not care who fired it. It functioned identically for the liberator and the occupier. And that neutrality, that mechanical indifference to the cause of whoever held it, was perhaps the most honest thing about the entire war. Weapons do not choose sides. They simply work. And the Sten, for all its ugliness, worked. Most stories of captured weapons end the same way. A soldier picks up an enemy rifle. The ammunition does not fit. The manual of arms is unfamiliar. Within days, the weapon is discarded or sent to the rear for intelligence evaluation. This is the normal fate of battlefield trophies. The M1 Garand, the finest semi-automatic rifle of the war, fired .30-06 Springfield. No German unit could sustain that supply. The Thompson submachine gun used .45 ACP a cartridge that existed in no German stockpile. The Soviet Mosin Nagant fired 7.62 by 54 mm rimmed ammunition incompatible with German feed systems. Captured weapons fail because wars are fought with logistics, not just with bullets. The Canadian-made Sten was the exception that proved the rule. Its 9 mm Parabellum chambering meant that every German ammunition dump in Europe could feed it. Its simple blowback mechanism meant that any soldier who had ever handled an MP-40 could operate it without instruction. Its stamped construction meant that it could be maintained with tools found in any workshop. And its stripped-down design philosophy meant that when Germany's own industrial capacity was finally gutted by Allied bombing, the Stens blueprint offered something no German weapon could: a way to arm a soldier for next to nothing. From the beaches of Normandy to the shattered factories of the collapsing Reich, the Sten traveled a path that no one who designed it had intended. A weapon conceived in British desperation, manufactured by Canadian workers on the shores of Lake Ontario, issued to Commonwealth soldiers fighting across northwest Europe, captured in the chaos of the most violent campaign in the Western theater, absorbed into the German logistics system with formal designations and recognized service status, and ultimately copied by some of the finest weapons engineers in the world, not because it was good, but because it was enough. That is the rare reverse story. Not a tale of technological superiority. Not a story of one side outgunning the other, but a story of simplicity so extreme that it erased the line between friend and enemy, between builder and imitator. The Sten asked nothing of whoever held it except a willingness to pull the trigger, and in the end, both sides answered.